Collecting Antique Maps, a beginner's guide to starting a lifetime's love affair with some of the most beautiful, informative, accessible and undervalued objects in the world of antiques, by Dr. David E. Parry. The course will be presented in 12 online modules by myself. I'm the curator for Bartele Gallery at the Mandarin Hotel, Jakarta, the only dedicated antiquarian map and print gallery in Indonesia. I'm also author of the book, The Cartography of the East Indian Islands. The course will cover every aspect of antique map collecting and should answer the myriad of questions asked by the new or novice collector, as well as provide information of value to the more experienced collector. Each module will consist of a theme, and although complete in itself, will be linked logically to the succeeding modules. The 12 complete modules have been summarized into a condensed online course consisting of 5 modules. And these 5 will be free to subscribers. Now, if these appeal to members, then they will be invited to participate in the full 12-module course at a cost of $500 for the full course. Now, antique maps have always held a fascination for me professionally as a geographer and soil scientist, historically as a keen student of history, and aesthetically as examples of the marriage of beauty, elegance and pragmatism. One only has to look at a modern map by the Ordnance Survey of Great Britain or any of the other national survey bodies to realize that elegance and pragmatism are there in abundance even today. But the uncluttered, clean lines, muted colors and abundant geospatial information contained in a modern map has a long and noble heritage, and one that the collector of antique maps becomes familiar with rapidly. One only has to think of the Renaissance voyages of discovery in the 16th century, where merchant adventurers backed by kings sought a sea route around the Horn of Africa to the spices and silks of the Orient in ships no larger than a North Sea trawler, to appreciate the appalling hardships and risks taken to navigate and chart the routes to these exotic places. But the mapping of the world began long before the 16th century, and its history can be traced back to classical times and the Greek belief in a spherical earth. Over the course of 3 millennia, the world has been mapped, and much of that mapping in the form of paper maps and charts ranging from 500 years old to 100 years can be acquired by the antique map collector for not an unreasonable sum of money. The object of this course on collecting antique maps is to introduce the subject to those of you who have an interest in maps but had not thought seriously about collecting them. So, how does one start a collection of antique maps? Why do you start a collection of antique maps? Well, there are any number of reasons, and I'm sure the collector will find one very quickly. Perhaps you're looking for rarity or beauty, conspiracy or historical importance. Well, this is all included in this beautiful map called Insulae Moluccae, a 16th century Portuguese map, although engraved by one of the great Dutch engravers, showing the Spice Islands and Southeast Asia at a level of detail known only to the Portuguese in the 16th century. And along the bottom, these beautiful engravings of the sandalwood, the nutmeg and the mace and the clove, these exotic products that brought the navigators and explorers to this part of the world. If you're looking for maps of classical origin, seriously old maps, then you need look no further than some of the early Ptolemaic maps of Southeast Asia. This particular map comes from the 1477 edition of Ptolemy's Cosmographia, and shows a rather strange configuration for Southeastern Asia, but one nonetheless that was used by many cartographers for many years after this, until the exploration of the region was more enabled more accurate charting. Perhaps you're interested in recording important events in history, or the perpetration of geographical myths. This map by Debris, the German geographer, published in 1598. This map shows the first Dutch fleet that went to Java, to Indonesia, leaving Holland in 1595. And here you see the 4 ships of the fleet sailing westwards. In fact, they'd come back from Madura, sailing around Madura Island and then coming back towards Sunda which was renamed Batavia. So here you see the first evidence of the very first expedition by Europeans to the Spice Islands. Now, perpetrating geographical myths, well, you only have to look a bit further north. You go up Sumatra towards what is called the Chersonese. This, of course, is the Malay Peninsula. Chersonese, so called the Chersonese because of the existence of alluvial gold in the area. And you can see a strait, a waterway, bisecting the peninsula. Now, of course, there is no waterway bisecting the peninsula, but the waterway as such represents 2 rivers. The river flowing into the South China Sea, and one, the Muar, flowing southwestwards into the Malacca Strait. Goods were hauled up the river, I've forgotten the name of it now, I'll have to do that one again, was hauled up the river to the watershed. There's a narrow watershed separating these 2 rivers, and then unloaded and then loaded again into boats that would sail down the Muar River into the Malacca Strait. Now, this was a time-consuming and complex operation, but nonetheless, it was done for valuable goods like gold or even spices, and it meant that the merchants would avoid sailing around what is now Singapore area, because this was infamous. These islands were infamous hideouts for the Malay pirates. So the cartographers of the time knew about the trade going from the South China Sea to the Malacca Strait. They knew about the river, both rivers, but they thought they were connected. So hence they perpetrated this myth of a waterway bisecting the Malay Peninsula. Now, if you're interested in ships and mermaids, sea monsters, then you can't do better than look at Ortelius's map of 1570. This is the classical map of Southeast Asia, produced in his Atlas Theatrum Orbis Terrarum, which in fact was the world's first uniform-sized atlas. There had been atlases before called Lefreri atlases, which were made up of individual sheets, but they were different sizes, different scales. The first time anybody had put all the maps in a proper sequence, same size sheets into one atlas. This is the map of Southeastern Asia. As you can see, lots of lovely ships, lots of mermaids and sea monsters, and also, of course, a world's first. For those of you of more nautical persuasion, you could do no better than to start collecting sea charts. Now, these are maps, of course, but they are maps that enable a sailor to sail from one place to another with a reasonable expectation of reaching the other end. These differ from maps. Looking at them, you can see visually that these have lots of crossed lines, diagonal lines. These are the rhumb lines or loxodromes and compass roses. This enabled the sailors to, navigators to take a bearing. So these are beautiful maps, beautiful charts, well worth collecting. If you like simplicity, clarity and elegance, then you must go for 19th century maps by cartographers like John Kerry. Really, these are forerunners of the kind of maps that you got in the Ordnance Survey. They did away with monsters, they did away with ships, they did away with any extraneous illustration, because they were concerned mainly with scientific accuracy, and with scientific accuracy was sort of married almost automatically with simplicity and cartographic elegance. So here you have an example of a early 19th century map of the East Indies by one of the most famous British cartographers, John Kerry. Now you can also have themes. You can collect maps, themes, if you wanted to just collect maps that showed animals, creatures. England and Wales here is seen as a sea monster. Many of the Belgian maps, the maps of the Low Countries, are shaped like a lion, Leo Belgicus. So this is another theme that you can collect. So you have to decide what will your area or theme be. So most collectors start with an area that they're familiar with. For example, the county that they were born in, the state or the country in which you were born, live or work. You can go by area, world maps, maps of continents, maps of countries. Collect maps by the map maker or cartographer. Collect maps according to the period, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century. Or, and this is very specialized, and not many collectors adopt this as a theme, but you can have it, let's say you're interested in geology, you can collect geological maps, land use maps, or political maps, maps of exploration, maps, military significance. In all military campaigns, maps are absolutely essential, and special maps were often made for specific military campaigns, of course, especially in the 20th century. You can collect maps that show local flora and fauna. And lastly, you collect maps for investment. Now that is a subject to which I will refer to much later on, but it is a theme for some collectors. So we mentioned English county maps. I started actually collecting English county maps as a teenager. They always appealed, and of course you can get some absolutely superb examples. England at this time, this particular map by Saxton, Christopher Saxton. I'm going to have to repeat all this, sorry. Christopher Saxton was the first atlas of English county maps. Again, rather like Ortelius, he produced maps at a standard size and scale, and they are very, very beautiful things, and today they're reasonably rare. If you want to collect world maps, twin hemisphere maps are always attractive and very collectible, and of course the price reflects that. Maps of the world with not twin hemisphere, what I'm calling here basically a Mercator projection, although of course this map by Ortelius is not a Mercator projection. But these again, this is a particular type of world map which is very popular with collectors. Now, where do you collect these maps? If you've decided on your theme, where are you going to obtain your maps? Well, any number of places. Your best bet is to start off with the antique map dealers. There are nearly all dealers now have websites, so you can just Google antique map dealers and you'll come up with a host of the world's leading antique map dealers, all of whom will have websites with details of their stock, details of their books, their references. So this is a good place for you to start your collection. But if you a little more traditional, maybe you prefer to actually go around and see the dealers in their shops, in their antique map shops. Well, this is getting increasingly difficult with the price of rent, a high price of rent in cities throughout the world. It's probably fair to say that most of the great antique map dealers have now shut up shop and now operate on the internet or from their home. Not entirely true. There are still a number of galleries in London, in Paris, New York, and Amsterdam, and you can find these. You can find the addresses online. Always best to actually visit a gallery and then to see the maps yourselves, handle the maps yourselves, and talk to the dealers. All the map dealers are enthusiasts, knowledgeable, and are only too willing to share their knowledge and passion with new collectors as well as with established collectors. Now, another source, antiquarian bookshops. Many antiquarian bookshops actually do sell maps as a sideline, if you like. And of course, antique maps are found bound into old books. So it's always worth having a look to see if you can find anything there. Another great source, of course, are the map fairs. Now, every year there are a number of international map fairs. The largest of these being in London, Miami, Florida, and Paris. And again, the dates for these will vary, but you can find all this information online. Just again, Google International Map Fairs. And again, if you get a chance, it's well worth going to one of these fairs because you will come into contact with all the world's leading antiquarian map dealers. And again, they're only too happy to share their knowledge with collectors. And you learn an enormous amount, and you have a chance to actually see and handle examples of all kinds of maps, from the very rare to fairly commonplace maps. But nonetheless, it's a chance to see the maps, handle the maps, and talk to the most knowledgeable people in the business. And lastly, antique shops, bric-a-brac shops, car boot sales. Now you can, I know this sounds maybe a bit odd, but it's amazing what you can pick up. It's a big chance, but you can find original antique maps. I have done so in antique shops, which don't specialize in maps, but just general antiques. In what I call bric-a-brac shops, probably would be called junk shops years ago. And in car boot sales. Now, you're not going to find much, or you're not going to find it very often, but you will find something, and it's a lot of fun trying. So once you've determined your theme, once you've started to collect your maps from the various sources of antique maps, another question that is often asked is, well, how do I know if it's an original map? Well, we have to define really what we mean by original. In terms of maps, most maps can be said to be original in that they are not they're not a fake, but it doesn't mean that there's only one copy of the map, because maps were made. The original of any very old map would be, if you like, the first sheet to be pressed, to come off either a wood block, which was the very earliest way of making maps, or a copper engraved plate. Now, the actual techniques of map making I will cover in a separate module. But for now, it's important to understand that when the maps were made, they were individual sheets of paper that were printed upon either woodblock or engraving through a printing press. They were printed one sheet at a time. So each map is an original. But if they print, let us say, 500 copies of one map from either the woodblock, the original woodblock, or from the copper plate, all 500 of those maps classify as original maps. They are from the first edition of that particular map. Now, if subsequently some changes are made to the original woodblock, maybe some more information is carved into the block or a name is taken out. Similarly with the engraved plate, maybe the plate being copper gets a bit soft and some of the lines that are etched in, they are shallow, so there has to be re-engraved. They may add more geographical information to that plate. They may take out the name of the sponsor and add another name. But whatever they do to the plate or woodblock, it then becomes a second state. They've changed the original. And then another 500 maps will be printed, all of which will be original, but they will be from that second state. So that's just to try and define what original in mapping terms means. And incidentally, people sometimes ask about fakes. Well, there are very few real fakes in the sense that some forgeries, shall we say, in the sense of sort of paintings. It would not really be worth your time or money to try and fake a map. It's extremely difficult to do. It has been tried, but this tends to be with very, very valuable maps, which is even more difficult to do. One of the most difficult things, of course, is to recreate the old paper, because paper for antique maps up to approximately 1800, all the paper was handmade from a mix of porridge of linen, and then put into mixed with water and put into a tray, flattened, allowed to dry, and then it would before it was printed upon, it would be sized with a kind of wallpaper size, usually made with a substance called or added to gum arabic. And this paper was thick, and you only have to hold it up to the light to see the lines in the paper that were caused by the mesh of chicken wire sort of thing that you had in the tray in which the paper was, the porridge for the paper was put. And these lines come through onto the original paper when it dries. So you can see that by holding it up to the light very clearly. Paper is thick and it's very robust, so it's very, very difficult to fake that paper. And then you have plate marks, a plate mark around the edge. Now the plate mark is the depression in the paper where the map was, where the press has pressed the paper down, and you get a ridge which you can feel with your finger, about 1 millimeter or so, around the edge of every boundary on the map. So this is the plate mark. You look for that if you're looking at an engraved old map. And then of course there's the colouring. Now all maps were originally printed in black and white. There was no colouring. There is one exception to that on the woodblock maps, where they actually would use black and some red, some rubefaction. But it was still a difficult thing to do, because you had to make sure that you registered everything accurately. But by and large, everything, certainly on engraved maps, everything was black and white. So colouring was added. It was usually added at the request of a purchaser, either in an atlas or in an individual sheet. And the colouring was done according to fairly strict rules and regulations. And sometimes, by and large, it was done by professional colourists, but occasionally you would find maps were coloured by well-known artists. There are a number of well-known Dutch artists who coloured maps, and of course if you are fortunate enough to be able to acquire such a map, then of course this adds enormously to the value. Now, colouring is a subject which needs to be explored in much more detail, and this I also will do in a later module. But for now, most maps you find on the market are coloured. If they were coloured around the time the map was printed, it's called original or contemporary colour. Anything else is modern colour. Does colouring a map detract from its value? For the purists, those who prefer to have a map that has not been doctored in any way from its original state, then yes, it does detract. But for most people and for most dealers, if the colouring is well done, it does not detract from the value of the map. And if it is genuine old colour and has been well done, then this will add to the value of the map. So colouring is a subject really all on its own, and a very interesting one, and one I will cover in much more detail in a later module. Now, a very quick word on map condition and defects. I mean, as we colouring affects condition, ideally you want a map that is in perfect condition, pristine. In other words, it's more or less as it came off the press. Now, such maps do exist, but they're pretty rare, and of course they're pretty expensive. The normal defects that a map will have: it has tears, it gets staining on it, things called wormholes. Again, I'll explain more about those later. It has a condition foxing, which means basically brown staining, which can be caused by fungus. Thing called verdigris damage. Now, verdigris comes back to the painting. Verdigris is a copper-based compound which was used in paints, the early paints. It's a blue-green compound. Once it oxidizes, the copper goes brown, and this causes very obvious staining on the map in those areas where a blue-green paint was used, and can actually cause the paper to become very brittle, and in some cases just drop out of the map. You have text, color, and print offset for various reasons. You have centerfold defects where the maps are bound into atlases, and often the margins are cut. So all these are defects about which I will speak more about later on. And then, of course, how much to pay for a map. Well, again, that's a subject that will have a module all on its own. So this is all I'm going to cover at this point. But what I will say is how I got into map collecting. As I said, I think I mentioned I began collecting county maps, English county maps. Then I started collecting maps of places, countries I worked in, as I worked overseas a lot as a soil scientist. And eventually, when I came to Indonesia, I started collecting maps of Indonesia. And of course, this beautiful country, this fascinating country, the home of the Spice Islands, was a rich, fertile ground for collecting maps. However, there didn't seem to be much in the way of reference books or anything on collecting maps of this region, which I found rather strange given the historical importance of Indonesia, especially the Spice Islands. And you may or may not know that the search for the Spice Islands was the sort of holy grail of the early Renaissance explorers. Even Christopher Columbus, who sailed westwards in his search for the Spice Islands, believed he was on the way to Cathay and eventually on the way to find the source of the spices. Most other explorers, like Magellan, They sailed eastwards and eventually did find the Spice Islands. However, at the time when I was collecting these maps, there were no references. There were a number of scholarly articles scattered around map journals, and even in some quite obscure places, which the academics could find, but the ordinary collector would be very lucky if he found these references. So I thought, well, why not write your own reference? Try and access as much as you can of these obscure references and pull them together. I also went through many of the standard map collecting books, and there were a lot this is in the early 90s, there were a lot on the market, and these all had something about the Spice Island mapping in them, but very little, and I decided to try and pool all this information into a more accessible and readable book. So I produced this book called The Cartography of the East Indian Islands, or Insulae Indiae Orientalis. It was very much a labour of love. It took me about 10 or 12 years to actually produce it, but it was a labour of love that I'd do again, and thoroughly enjoyed it. So that's how I got into map collecting, and this was the result of my years of collecting, and I hope that I've enthused or managed to enthuse a lot more of you to begin this fascinating and rewarding hobby. Thank you very much.